Hello and welcome to Trustworthy AI, de-risk business adoption of AI. I'm talking here to Tamra Moore, and our topic today is healthcare algorithmic transparency. Um, as you know, I have been talking about using trustworthy AI or trusted pillars of AI to de-risk business adoption. And I really firmly believe that we can achieve trustworthy AI at a systemic level in order to really see the benefits of AI. Tamra, let me talk about my distinguished guest today, Tamra. She is an attorney with over 15 years of federal government and private sector litigation and regulatory experience. She's currently in-house counsel at a global financial services company where she's advising the chief data officer others on legal as well as regulatory compliance issues. Some of these issues are related to the development and use of AI and ML models in consumer-facing products and internal operations. Earlier in her career, she was senior counsel in the United States Department of Justice Civil Division. Tamra has an undergraduate degree in biomedical ethics. She is one of a handful of lawyers in the country with a visible external profile as a thought leader on legal issues associated with the use of AI ML in healthcare. So I'd like to stress that again, Tamara, that is so impressive. One of the few lawyers in the country with who's a thought leader on legal issues associated with the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in healthcare. Last year, at the invitation of the NIH and Agency for Healthcare Quality and Research, she participated on a consensus panel looking at racial bias in healthcare algorithms. In December, the panel published their recommendations in a JAMA network open article. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to you, Tamra, and see if there is anything else you'd like to add.
Sure. As you mentioned, I do try to speak at different conferences or write about AI in healthcare. Recently, I participated on a panel at Hopkins Healthcare Business Conference where we presented on artificial intelligence, innovation, and ethical and equitable implementation. I've also talked about or written about predicting the future of HHS regulation of race-based algorithms. So this is an area that I care deeply about and try to follow as closely as I can.
Wow. So I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with you about not only the regulatory climate, but how it impacts what we do next and how we make sense at an organizational level of adopting this into practical guidance. So I'd like to start off with what is the U.S. regulatory climate or landscape with respect to the use of AI in healthcare?
Sure. So right now, we're probably in the nascent stages of at least federal regulatory guidance and actions related to healthcare and the use of AI. The President Biden's executive order that was published in October laid out directives for about a dozen federal agencies, including the Department of Health and Human Services. And with respect to the Department of Health and Human Services, there were a number of different directions to that agency about putting in place guidance for hospital systems on how to handle the use of race-based and ethnic-based algorithms and some other basically governance regulations. And so I think we're starting to see the beginnings of some of those directions coming forward. And actually, one of the final rules of the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology recently published a final rule in December that is probably one of the first regulations requiring basically risk management, responsible AI for health IT developers.
So that is really interesting, the approach that the US has taken on this in terms of regulating AI. And of course, the executive order is not legislation. So it is, it's almost the
Directions or instructions.
right. So I'm very interested in hearing what HHS's rule. I think the one you're referring to is the one on algorithmic transparency. What is it?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, ONC, the Office of the National Coordinator, issued a final rule that updates ONC's Health IT certification program. That program is a voluntary, standards-based certification program for certain types of health IT. And basically, if you're a developer and your product falls within this certain subset of health technology tools, ONC put out this final regulation that sets out a couple of different rules, but one that we're talking about here today is their transparency and risk management regulations, and basically requiring developers of predictive decision support intervention tools, it's a mouthful, to implement certain basically certain governance requirements that are aimed at one, promoting accuracy, promoting transparency, and things like that. So, for example, one of the requirements that this particular rule imposes is requiring developers of health IT modules to list a source of attributes, which are basically like data points that are information related to their tool. So things like, what was the intended population user, what are the out of scope uses, what are the types of input features, what process did the developer use to ensure fairness, including like a description of their efforts to reduce or mitigate bias. And so basically you could see along, you mentioned earlier your pillars of, AI governance. I think that this rule mirrors that, those requirements of transparency, accuracy, fairness. In fact, I think they talk about what they call faves, which is basically like their pillars of fairness, accuracy, verification, explainability, and security.
Okay.
Safety.
Okay, that's good to know. What, do you feel it is clear enough as to who has to do what in order to comply with it? In other words, in an organization, is it IT only, or is it other stakeholders within the organization that will be involved in compliance and creating that framework for risk management around that?
Sure. So, I mean, basically, I think it is pretty clear, because this applies to a certain specific narrow subset of health information technology tools.
Okay.
And these are things that sort of interact with electronic health records that help doctors make decisions about diagnoses, prognosis, things like that. And so it really would apply to a certain subset of algorithmic tools. It doesn't necessarily prescribe, exact requirement. There's some flexibility in how you go about complying with this final regulation, but the goals and its purpose are pretty clear that, it's to provide end users, whether those are providers, with information about how this tool was developed, what data went into it, is the data that went into it representative of, a particular geographic area? How does that transfer over into whatever health system is using it? That type of information, which I think hopefully will be helpful for people to understand the context of when it's appropriate to use certain algorithmic tools and when it's not.
Yes, thank you. So you mentioned that's very helpful. Thank you. You mentioned that it is for predictive tools. Now, that doesn't mean it is only for what we have been using so far, as in predictive AI, or does it apply to large language models or generative AI in general systems?
So this is just predictive tools. So things like basically using AI to, predict certain outcomes or certain diagnoses. So where you typically would see it are things like diagnosing a patient, monitoring for physiological changes in a patient, treatment, decision making, those types of tools that usually interact or interface with electronic health records and other, um, basically other IT systems in hospitals that sort of drive providers or doctors' decision making for patient care.
Okay, thank you. Um, let's take a look at the broader regulatory climate, especially as it comes to recently we saw the European Parliament voted to pass the EU AI Act.
Yeah.
What does that act require generally, and how does that impact developers of healthcare algorithms?
Sure. So the EU AI Act, which was passed or last week, I should say, applies to providers or developers for placing AI systems into the market or AI services that are used in the EU. So basically, it applies to developers or providers. The statute references providers that are both in the EU and outside of the EU. The key here is whether it has an impact on users who are located in the EU. It's a risk-based statutory scheme, so it classifies risks and high risk. High risk uses of AI have the most regulatory requirements around them, a lot of the transparency, governance, risk management type of requirements. It also identifies certain types of use cases that would fall within that high risk category, and healthcare is one of those areas. And so it basically requires certain reporting requirements. Developers of these tools would need to implement data governance standards, standards for accuracy, robustness, cybersecurity. I mean, when we talk about responsible AI, and you're talking about all of those, like the policies and procedures that companies, healthcare systems, hospitals put into place to ensure that their tools are being used safely, all of those requirements are sort of laid out in the EU AI Act for developers. It also requires, it imposes some obligations on users of these tools to the extent that they're making modifications of the tool. So it's actually really, I don't hate to say the word robust again, but robust statutory scheme that imposes, significant requirements on developers or providers of AI tools, and in the space of healthcare, like the EU AI Act doesn't differentiate between sectors or industries, which is unlike the United States, where we have very sector specific laws. The EU AI Act applies to AI that falls within its definition. It's broadly defined. And really the classification is whether it is high risk or not.
Right, and that really is a very kind of different approach in terms of not being sector specific, whereas the one in the US being sector specific and guidance coming from HHS, for example, for healthcare, as opposed to, you know, in more general kind of.
Right. Sort of in the same way that we're waiting for federal privacy law, a
Right.
privacy law that covers um, all industries and isn't necessarily sector specific. Yes, so that HHS is responsible for, and the executive order that President Biden issued in October kind of lays that out. Basically, makes that illustrates what you're saying, where Department of Defense is responsible for the use of AI by our military installations and organizations. HHS is responsible for it with respect to healthcare. FTC, regulates the use of AI to the extent that it doesn't fall into other agencies' buckets. And, to the extent that that developers of AI are creating these tools that, somehow impact consumers in an unfair or deceptive way.
Right.
So,
Yeah, true. I mean, I think that kind of leads me to my final kind of question I wanted to talk about, and get your thoughts on. What are some of the challenges of implementing a governance framework for healthcare? Um,
um,
right. I mean, there's all this. Yes, go ahead.
well, I've been thinking about this a lot. Because I mean, healthcare is so critical. We all use the healthcare system or have access to it. Um, it makes important decisions about, life or death. And so I think some of the challenges are one, just do hospital systems have governance in place now for their AI uses? I think there was a recent study that basically sent out a survey to 3 dozen hospitals and healthcare systems asking about the state of their governance of AI. And I think only 16% of the responders said that they have, a governance program in place that has specific AI policies. And so I think that's one of the challenges is scaling a governance program in these hospital systems. And, it's not just the tools or the AI that's being used to diagnose us. It's also the AI that triages patients in an emergency room or, determines whether there's sufficient beds in a hospital system. I mean, it's all of those uses. I think that is one of the biggest challenges, just getting your arms around all of the uses of AI, understanding where they're being used, and basically scaling the governance program. I think another area that will be a challenge is what I'll call accountability.
Mhm.
When AI fails or fails somebody, who's accountable? Who is responsible for the harm that creates? And I think it's especially difficult in healthcare because we, as patients, won't always know when AI is being used in our healthcare. Every time you go to the doctor and they draw blood and you get, a list of statistics about your cholesterol, your kidney function, that is a type of, I'll put it in loose quotes, like AI or rule-based tools that are giving information about your health. And do you know if they're one of those tools is using race or ethnicity in a way that has no biological basis? I wouldn't know. Most people probably wouldn't know. So one of the things is like, how do you provide this information to the community, to patients? Um, and two, even if they have that information, who do you hold responsible? Do you hold the provider responsible? I think one of the challenges is that there's, a lack of understanding about how AI is used, and providers are already overburdened.
Yeah.
So the idea that they're going to go and train on what, types of AI and understanding how these tools work seems like it would be a challenge. Do you hold the developer of the tool responsible? So, I mean, those are the challenges that I see. But, at the same time, the use of AI in healthcare is exciting. There's a lot of opportunity. I think it can do a lot of good. And it's just, making sure, kind of bringing it back home to how we opened up this podcast, talking about, the pillars of responsible AI. It's making sure that those systems are in place to mitigate any of the harms that could come when, AI fails, because it's not always going to be perfect.
Yes, thank you. That is a great perspective on, doing that 360 kind of a view of what we have, what we need. And even if we have what we need, is that going to be enough to reduce or mitigate the risks that are possible with, such high impact technology such as AI? And by that, I mean, that statistic you shared about how many hospitals have governance in place. And when it comes to AI, it's a fraction, right?
Yeah.
It's less than a quarter. And not only that, just a transparency requirement with, even if it is based on some of the essential pillars of trustworthiness, is that may not be enough, because even if AI system is making the decision, or this is what it is telling, coming out with in terms of recommendations, that's not enough. Transparency by itself will not be sufficient to protect you from the fallouts or any of the harm. So I think it is definitely something to think about, because we are at the cusp of not only highlighting what the issues are, but how we go forward in terms of taking the right approach, when it comes to governance.
Yeah.
Uh,
I just have one other thought about that, sort of to build on what you were saying about the need for AI governance. I know that in the insurance industry, for example, there are state regulations that require life insurers to have governance programs in place to govern their use of AI in underwriting and marketing and claims reimbursement, because of the, sort of the harms that are at issue when um, you're using AI to make those types of
yeah, I
decisions.
mean,
I think it is only a matter of time before we see some requirement in healthcare. And it really, in my mind, I mean, I understand that hospital administration is challenging and difficult. There aren't enough resources, but I think that this is going to be an area where we're going to see hospital systems, healthcare system, academic medical systems having to scale a governance program. Um, so, in my personal opinion, better to start earlier
right.
in thinking about these issues than, have a requirement that's on the books and now you're under a deadline to comply.
Thank you. I agree with that. I think that's an excellent conclusion remark. If if you like to add something, please do share with us, Tamara. If not, I think that's a perfect conclusion. So it's floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me.
Yes, absolutely. Those were great insights. Ray, thank you very much. Okay, bye.
Thank you.